So this is the area that my project specifically tries to get at, which is sort of if you look at the previous map, it is a kind of westerly shift from there. And this area today is the site of India's largest coal field, and arguably its most significant coal field. Historically the largest. It has been eclipsed in the last 2 decades by several other fields. But the province is known as Manbhum, and the field itself is the Charia coal field. And this is sort of a cross-section of that topographical survey. And you can really see the kind of detail with which many of the surveyors conducted their work. And this is a photograph of that area prior to the advent of the coal industry in this region. And what I really want to emphasize for those of you who are not familiar with the territory that I'm talking about, the area where the coal economy kind of opens up at the end of the 19th century is very much a frontier area. It's an area of sparse agrarian settlement. It's an area that was never properly surveyed in terms of revenue ownership rights. It was an area of deep security concerns for the British Empire. And it turns into this sort of major site of industrial capital. Here's another photograph from the period. Okay. So what I thought that I would do to talk about the work is to read the introduction to the chapter that kind of orients the theoretical perspective that I'm trying to get at, particularly focusing on this question of ground rent, the question of the invention of mineral property, and this other idea of value grabbing. So, the expansion of coal mining into the Bengal uplands and the Chotanagpur Plateau during the 19th century evoke the image of a frontier space comprised of forests, uncultivated wastelands, and uncivilized low caste and indigenous peoples coming within the embrace of modern commerce, law, and infrastructure. The transformation of the region by coal mining could hardly be remarked upon at mid-century. Then, by the 1860s, reports and scientific surveyors began noting with greater frequency collieries and coal wharves, abandoned mine shafts and quarries, and coal barges and coal-laden bullock carts moving throughout the river valleys of the upper Damodar and Barakar. Traveling to the region in 1868, Bholanath Chunder remarked in amazement at his arrival in Raniganj, the company town controlled by the Bengal Coal Company, and describing how, quote, as one stands with his head projected out of the train, the infant town bursts on the sight from out an open and extensive plain, with its white sheening edifices, the towering chimneys of its collieries, and the clustering huts of its bazaar, looking like a garden in a wilderness, and throwing a luster over the lonely valley of the Damodar. By the 1890s, these Faustian outposts of progress extended westward in a long arc from Raniganj, the terminus of the original 1853 East India Railway, to the coal seams of Manbhum and Hazaribagh, the valleys and lower escarpments of the Chotanagpur Plateau. Commenting on the congruity of these spaces during a train journey from Hazaribagh to Raniganj in 1895, the first inspector of India's mines, James Grundy, imagined that when traveling at night through the coal areas, he could, quote, well fancy himself in the heart of the Black Country in England, end quote. This chapter seeks to situate the transformation of the agrarian landscape of the Bengal uplands and the Chotanagpur Plateau under the expansionary drive for Indian coal between 1870 and 1918. The transformation of this rural area into an industrial area, in the words of one colonial official, was produced through the westward shift of the mining frontier from the old collieries of the lower Raniganj coalfield to the new coalfields of upper Raniganj, Barakar, and Charia in the 1890s, a shift which provided the conditions for an unprecedented boom in coal production, beginning in 1893 and ending in a fit of overproduction and devaluation in 1908. The boom period of the coal economy left in its wake a redefined agrarian political economy, and critically, a conceptual reorientation of social actors to their land. Extensive tracts of coal-bearing land coming under the control of zamindars, coal companies, land speculators, and cultivating tenure holders led to a reappraisal of the value of land not in terms of agriculture, but in terms of minerals. The economic compulsions unleashed by the flow of coal from the plateau region indexed a fundamental transformation in the legal status of agrarian property, which now required a definitional remit to accommodate the growing value of the region's subterranean wealth. In order to track these shifts, this chapter will use the category of ground rent as a lens to understand the centrality of agrarian property relations to the coal economy. There are several reasons for doing this, but perhaps most significant is the fact that prior to the period of the coal boom, there existed no singular law governing mineral property rights in the region. A mineral property, I will argue, was an invention of colonial civil courts and reflected the complicated social conflicts over land which eventually resulted in India's rentier class, zamindars, coming to own the rights of minerals. The rights of zamindars to collect rents from coal were not, as pre-existing studies have simply assumed, the immemorial rights attendant upon the members of a feudal aristocracy. Rather, these rights were retrospectively inferred and subsequently codified into law between 1900 and 1911 in a context of significant challenges to the institution of zamindari by new tenancy laws affirming occupancy or rayati rights. The ultimate affirmation of zamindars as proprietors of the subsoil represents an historical anomaly in the trajectory of tenancy laws in British India after 1885, which scholars from a variety of analytical perspectives have emphasized represented a turn towards indigenous custom, frequently at odds with notions of aristocratic privilege in political economic thought. Foregrounding questions of ground rent forces us to recognize conflicts over property rights as social conflicts over the distribution of rents or surplus values. For too long, histories of agrarian transformation by commodity production in colonial India have worked through a narrowly conceived framework of primitive accumulation, or the expropriation of a variety of differently conceived commons by private property regimes, without attending adequately to the simultaneous endurance and transformation of pre-capitalist forms of social power. This methodological orientation has considered the development of commodity relations through the nation-centered scale of India's transition to capitalism as nothing else but the destruction of the pre-capitalist community, end quote. As such, primitive accumulation and its attendant modes of coercive non-market power is often represented as the primary mechanism by which capitalism in India is said to function, here through forms of legal and state violence, rather than through the internalization of commodity relations within social or cultural relations that appear to stand outside spheres of production and exchange. And rent as a category certainly stands outside of what we normally consider the sort of realm, these specifically bounded realms of production and exchange. The effects of emphasizing this model of primitive accumulation, as many critics of the post-colonial interpretation of Marx had pointed out early on, is to mistake histories of becoming or modes of articulation for reified binary oppositions, right? So community against capital, right? As opposed to the transformation of community. More practically, in searching for a source of non-market coercive authority as the primary mode of capitalist reproduction, post-colonial historians of South Asia have tended to obscure analyses of changing forms of social power as the source of inequality and inequity in questions that remain external to the societies and cultures under scrutiny. The concept of value grabbing rather than land grabbing expands our understanding of primitive accumulation and the historically specific ways in which the coal economy came to transform social relationships in the plateau region. Value grabbing denotes processes of accumulation, the appropriation of natural resources as commodities, that is not, in the first instance, a specific form of commodity production. In this case, value grabbing means social struggles to create, control, and generate profits from nature through the legal mechanism of rent. Acquiring coal rents in the border space of the Chotanagpur Plateau and upland Bengal, the major site of coal production during the post-1890s boom, did not always entail the working of coal for the market. Rents were used to keep competitors out, to speculate on land, to settle laborers, and in the context of the specific agrarian economy of this region, to actually purchase rights to seasonal labor, right? So like feudal rights to laboring days. Rents were also used as a strategy to control common resources, like forests or waterways, in order to coerce cultivators to work in neighboring mines. The creation of rents often required the intervention of state officials in the form of surveyors, revenue authorities, and civil courts. So these maps, in some senses, are actually crucial. However, rents were also created through forged documentation, through a deceit and coercion, right? So it's not simply about making minerals legible that allowed people to derive rents from them. Many actors who are interested in extracting profits from mines don't want these things to be legible. Value struggles over rent, captured here in the term value grabbing, is therefore a more expansive representation of the operations of the coal economy in this historically specific context. The method pursued here follows a historical genetic framework of uncovering the agrarian history of the region by unfolding the category of rent. This procedure necessarily requires a rethinking of the categories of agrarian political economy in the region, particularly the identity of zamindari and of land itself. As the foregoing will hopefully demonstrate, the identity of a specific rentier class or interest cannot be identified through the ideological decoding of political economy, howsoever sophisticated that decoding might be. Rather, the identity must be located as emergent from within the interplay of social struggles over land and its juridical legal coding within historical practice. Zamindars, as other types of rent receivers in the plateau region, cannot be understood as historical remnants or as exemplars of an anachronistic agrarian society juxtaposed against a modern commercial sector. In struggling to control the value production of the agrarian economy through the medium of rent, the category of zamindari captures the sedimentary character of agrarian capitalism, wherein the form of society that emerges from the social changes unleashed by the coal economy contains within it many aspects of the structures or social order which preceded it. The argument of this chapter will follow 3 steps. The first section will examine the conflicting modes of establishing property rights in the plateau region, and the evidence presented in this section suggests that specific zamindari property rights were consolidated under the Encumbered Estates Act, a law providing a debt shelter to the region's zamindars, compelling them to turn their land into profitable rent-seeking ventures. The second section locates this consolidation of zamindari property and specific struggles over the distribution of mining rents. And this section demonstrates how zamindars came to behave like coal companies and coal companies like zamindars. The third section attempts to bring these prior analyses together by reading closely a series of civil case decisions that ultimately found mineral property to be the property of zamindars. I argue here, crucially, that the right to collect subterranean rents naturalized the agrarian social order, linking the identity of zamindari property with the coal economy. These conflicts over the distribution of rental rights here became conflicts over the distribution of value as the region became ever more integrated into the expansionary drive for cheap fuels. So I don't really have time to go much further into what the chapter does, but this very brief graph sort of shows the kind of massive expansion of coal production that took place in this period under a review and the devastation of the land that sort of was attendant upon that expansion. Here is a sort of another chart that sort of tracks the different types of tenure relationships in the coal area. And this sort of looks at sort of questions of land alienation, sort of trying to understand how the commodification of land led to sort of the sort of vast dispossession through market mechanisms in the particular area of Manbun, the area on the bottom there. And just some photographs. And that's it. Yeah.
fantastic. We do have time for some questions. Yes, we do. What I think I'll do is, not to shock you too much, but I'll turn the lights on so we can wake up a little bit. Yeah, brace yourselves. And I guess the usual thing to do is bring the speakers to the front, and they can field whatever questions you may have. Is there anybody who has? Oh, you have it ready.
First, I have two questions. One, Siobhan, you briefly flashed a picture, a photo by Edward Brzezinski.
Yes.
On the screen, and I'm a big fan of Brzezinski, and I mean a lot of his work. But I wonder if you could talk about how he fits into this framework that you have developed. Do you view him as a critical landscape photographer, or do you view his work as falling in some way into the mainstream of landscape photography in a new way? But I mean, how do you assess Brzezinski's work?
Brzezinski is a complicated case, and people have very polarized opinions. People either tend to see it as a very radical critique or as kind of continuing that aestheticization and moving it from the political to just the realm of formalism. I think there's something that's in between that's a little bit more accurate. Brzezinski himself is pretty clear about the fact that his interest is the formal properties of this work. His work definitely has a political lens, but he said himself a million times, he himself is not overly political. That being said, his work is used in really political ways by curators, by critics, by writers. So I think that it really plays an important role in visualizing some of these processes and making things a little less abstract. I mean, there's this question of scale and depopulation. Like it continues some of those traditions of landscape. But I think if we're still talking about landscape as a genre, it's probably, it has the most potential in doing that. I think it's just always interesting to take his work and then work back from it. So the processes that he's documenting on the level that very few people can do, both access and like those huge aerial shots, like those are really complicated both technically and in terms of getting access. So I think ultimately his work is important, but I think it requires work by other people to give that context to people so that it's not just aesthetic.
I have a second question, but maybe you want to go first. Well, this one's for David. A few weeks ago, Michael Clare published an article online at Tom Dispatch speculating that given the affinities between Trump and Putin and the moves toward restoring very friendly relations with Saudi Arabia, that we might see emerging a potential new global order with the fossil fuel states battling to preserve their dominance in an era in which an ever-increasing share of the world's population is going to embrace green energy technology. So he's speculating that there may be a new dichotomy in the world between the fossil fuel-based regimes and states, the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia on one hand, and then Marco in the EU, and perhaps China and India as a more a greenish bloc. Is there any? What would you think of that? It seems like overly schematic to me.
Yeah, it does seem overly schematic. It seems to, to scale the problem purely at the level of the nation state, right? It's when we look at what's happening with the global oil market, with the supply gluts and the failure of OPEC to meaningfully coordinate supply cuts in order to drive the price back up. The kind of anarchic production of shale gas in the United States, shale oil. I don't know. These are phenomena that are driven by a combination of states and markets working in concert. I don't really see. I think that the dynamic that everyone is speaking to, like when Timothy Mitchell wrote Carbon Democracy, it was still the primary dynamic that people were thinking of as shaping the future of fossil fuels was peak supply. There was still, throughout the mid 2000s, right up until around the time when it's published in 2011, everyone's talking about peak supply. And it's completely shifted now, right? There's no longer any talk of peak supply. It's all about peak demand. And so I think that the forces of peak demand are much more likely to shape the future of the continued viability of fossil fuel than any kind of militarized block of these kind of regressive petrostates attempting to force a continuation of fossil capitalism.
I'd actually pose something related to sources for Shubham and Matt. This could possibly be related to the photographer you're talking about, because I don't know who that is, but a lot of the sources of the listed citations from the photographs were from the mine archive, and I was hoping we could say a little bit more about, or if you know at all about the photographers who were taking those pictures. Were they mine photographers employed by the mine, or were they, did they have a totally different sort of entry point into this landscape photography? And then Matt, for the process of sort of knowing where the coal was and sort of making it legible, there's certainly the surveys, the map surveys. Were there other ways that you saw in research in which these places became legible to the authorities, or were there other actors that became useful in that process? Or were the survey maps really the critically useful source, I guess, of figuring that out?
So the archive I'm primarily working with is actually an amateur archive compiled by local historians. So it's the Mining Museum archive.
Yeah.
But because of the very short time frame of extraction in the community, you don't really have any sort of large scale corporate